that with a lot of people in this area of Leeds, we'll talk about the other couple of areas we're talking about in a minute, but in Hare Hills in Leeds, there are lots of people who do not clearly, because we've seen the footage and we've heard from on the ground earlier in the programme, who do not uphold British values, who do not respect the rule of law. What is your thought on this, Philip?
Hi, Peter. First of all, it's really nice to speak to you. I think the problem is that we can't, as a society, even begin to have the conversation. A sensible, facts-based, evidence-based conversation about social unrest. As we've seen in the media, the mainstream media I'm talking about here, and as we've seen from politicians, we immediately, as a default, go to the narrative and a set of myths. So immediately, Alex Sobel, MP for Leeds, was blaming Nigel Farage for a tweet. And I'm just looking at the footage here on the screen. And Nigel Farage's tweet apparently is responsible. Okay.
We had someone earlier in the programme, and he's a very good reporter on the scene, but he was talking about how young people had nowhere to go because a couple of community centres had been shut down, and how it was important that they were reopened. And I said, unfortunately, the money that may have reopened those community centres will now have to go into rebuilding Hare Hills and paying for the buses and so on, and perhaps the people who had done this who should have thought about that beforehand. The people don't riot because there aren't any leisure centres.
No, I mean, that's just nonsense. Of course it's nonsense, and nobody accepts that. But again, I have to get back to the fact that I do want to make this point. It's that we are dealing with myths here, you know.
What are those myths? Tell us what we're told, and tell us what's true.
Okay, well, Nigel Farage is held up immediately to be the villain of the piece, and the Green Councillor of Hare Hills is presented as a hero.
Oh, he's a hero. He's been stopping things. Everything's been perfect. He's been wonderful.
Exactly.
The guy who shouted Allahu Akbar when he was elected, apparently thinks that's an appropriate thing to say when you're elected a Green Councillor. He apparently is a wonderful person who's been going around trying to stop all these things happening. He won't come on the show, by the way. We've asked him.
Yeah, so he's presented by the independent newspaper today as a hero. Now, he has no interest in social cohesion. He is a sectarian. Yet,
I'm sure you would deny that, but maybe you could just present your evidence for that, Philip.
Well, you've just presented it yourself. He was screaming Allahu Akbar when he was elected as Green Councillor for Hare Hills. He is festooned in Palestinian imagery, and he is the councillor for Hare Hills. He is a sectarian. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that. And what I'm saying is we need to look at this footage as footage, just footage in its own right. We need to strip it of the narrative, wicked, evil, hero, the fairy tale approach we have to social unrest in this country. We need to get rid of all of that. We need to get rid of ideology. We need to get rid of highly contested political and theoretical concepts, and we need to look at what's going on. So the first thing we need to do is say, are we seeing the same thing here? Who are the perpetrators? What's going on? And unfortunately, we're a million miles away from that. We're so far down the road to sectarianism. It's extremely worrying, but we can't even begin the conversation to stop it.
I want to go back to Peter Blexley in a second, but just before I do, Philip, I want to ask you a question, because I read the initial coverage of this in two of the biggest mainstream media outlets in the country, the BBC and Sky News, and in neither report did they mention anything to do with ethnicity, religion, anything at all. It was people are doing this, people are doing that. I mean, we need the facts here. We need to have an honest discussion about this. There are people in this country from whatever background, but they clearly appear to be from a similar background in many of these examples that we've seen, who do not uphold the British values of rule of law. It's just, that's not a racist thing to say. That is a factual thing to say.
Well, that's just what I've been talking about for the last few minutes, isn't it, basically, in a nutshell. What we need to have is a sense of reassurance that everybody is subject to the same rules and regulations, that there are not enclaves, particular silos in particular areas of cities in the UK that have their own tribal and religiously based set of rules and regulations, because that's bad for everybody. But most of all, actually, it's bad for the vulnerable people in those places. I'm not going to use the word communities because it's meaningless now. It doesn't mean anything. I'm talking about those places. That sense of tribalism is the only word I can use, really needs to be got rid of. But we can't do that until we start telling the truth, until we say facts, evidence, and actually what's happened is not far right. You are not going to be subject to cancellation, social ostracization if you tell the truth. We need to have a conversation where whoever comes to the table in good faith and says what's going on. I mean, just in terms of bare facts, that's the starting point. But as I say, Peter, we're a million miles away from that starting point.
Well, I'll ask you perhaps in a second how we get a little bit closer to it. But first of all, I want to ask Peter Bleksley what you make of what Philip's just said.
Well, first of all, there's a bit of contradiction in there, because this is the forum in which we're having exactly the conversation he's talking about. We're discussing it here. I'm frequently on this channel talking exactly about these kind of matters. What I would like to say is there was some disruption that went completely under the radar because Leeds and Hare Hills got all the headlines. Thursday night, Whitechapel.
Yeah, tell me about
East
that.
London.
Tell me about that.
Whitechapel in East London has a substantial population of Bangladeshi origin. Currently, in Bangladesh, in the last few days and weeks, there has been rioting, loss of life, because Bangladeshi is set against Bangladeshi over matters that I'm no expert in. But Nigel Farage's tweet, which attracted so much attention and so much criticism, was actually almost entirely correct, because on Thursday night in Whitechapel, Bangladeshi was against Bangladeshi on the streets of London, in a mirror image of what has been playing out in Bangladesh. So Nigel Farage's tweet was actually accurate, except he'd got the location wrong. It was Whitechapel. That's exactly where the culture and the discord and the infighting and the hatred of a land many, many miles away was brought to the streets of London. There were injuries to the police. Shields were deployed. They separated two fighting factions of Bangladeshi versus Bangladeshi, and a lot of police officers were deployed there, which enabled them to quell what quite possibly could have turned into horrendous bloodshed.
And very difficult for police to understand even the motivations of that, given that it is based on a complicated conflict many miles away.
Exactly. And how? Of course, we shouldn't expect our frontline police officers to be aware of every global event and every corner of the earth, and therefore be able to relate to whosoever it is that's trying to spill blood on our streets. That's just, quite frankly, ludicrous. You might expect community police officers, if there were such a thing, to be aware of the rising tensions and to be aware of the facts that lay behind it, but not your average cop that's going to be a response officer and hurry to the calls, of which there were a number on Thursday evening about this disturbance in Whitechapel.
There's another incident that actually a viewer has got in touch with me about. This is in Ireland, around Dublin and Coolock. 3 Gardaí police officers in Ireland were injured, including one taken to hospital. One person was arrested following disturbances there. A disused factory in the area went on fire following a protest against its use as accommodation for asylum seekers. And clearly in Ireland as well, Philip, I'm sure you're familiar with this. I'm not going to ask you about this specific incident, don't expect you to know everything about it, but clearly in Ireland as well as in the United Kingdom, there are so many people who are worried about the changing character of their countries, about immigration, about the rule of law, and the fact that people are attempting in some way to subvert that. You talked about us being a million miles away from the correct conversation. How do we get closer to it, Philip?
Yeah, it's a really good point. Can I just address Peter's point there?
Sure, go ahead.
There was no contradiction. This channel presents itself as different. It presents itself as a free speech space, which is different to the rest of the mainstream media. And I'm very pleased to be able to come on and talk about it. I'm talking about the mainstream media. I'm talking about the institutions. I'm talking about education. I'm talking about the civil service, all of those things. You try and have this conversation in a university and see where it gets you.
Like you'd agree with that, Peter. He's nodding his head.
I'm nodding and ironically chuckling. Of course.
Yeah. Okay. And that's not. I'm not having a go at Peter. I pretty much agree with
no one has a go on Peter. Because I'll defend him.
We need to stop this indoctrination that the kind of the white privilege, the mythology against white working class people, against the far right, against dismissing concerns. I think we need to go right down to education, and we need to kind of stop. It's the same old thing, isn't it? We need to stop demonizing our country. We need to stop presenting Britain, the British, and British history as the most terrible thing in the world, because it's clearly not the case, okay? People wouldn't want to come here in their hundreds of thousands and indeed millions in terms of gross numbers every year if that were the case. So we need to stop telling people that we are wicked. That's the first stage. And when I say starting the conversation, I mean starting the conversation at education. I mean starting the conversation at nursery. Now, that's not to go completely the other way and say, you know, this country is just completely and utterly wonderful and it's never done anything wrong. No country can ever say that. But as a cultural historian, I'm often really concerned, upset and frightened about how we present ourselves, because what we do, we are hypercritical of ourselves in a completely unrealistic way on the one hand, and we are completely uncritical of everybody else because we are dealing in myths and romanticism. Yeah. We are not dealing in facts. We are not dealing in historical facts. Okay, that's the first stage. Yeah. Okay. The second stage is to divest the institutions and all of the taxpayer-funded things to get rid of all of that ideology, that contested ideology, the rainbow lanyards in the NHS, for example, all of those things. Stop all of that. Now, I'm talking, you know, a couple of weeks after a Labour government's just been elected, so that definitely isn't going to happen. So I started this conversation by saying I'm really concerned about what's going on. Yeah. I'm extremely concerned about the future. I know what we should be doing, and I don't think anybody in their right mind would say we should be presenting a false narrative of history about ourselves. But we are not going to change that in the near future. Okay. So we really have to think about damage limitation.
Philip, thank you. Final thought from Peter on all of this.
Thursday night in Hare Hills in Leeds showed what senior police will deny and what politicians will deny. And this is a fact. In the UK, there are particular neighbourhoods that are no-go areas where the police simply are afraid to tread. And that's not going to change as long as we have concentrated populations in neighbourhoods who shun our rule of law, who do not share our vision, our cultures, and who, quite frankly, have almost very little in common with us. And until we start reaching out as police officers, not in a fluffy, flaky, Neely kind of nonsense way, but in a way that proudly says we are the police, we are here to enforce the law, we are here to detect and prevent crime, and we're unashamedly going to do that. Until that happens, these kind of situations are only going to repeat themselves.
Thank you. A fascinating discussion. I've really enjoyed the last 20 minutes.